Hey everybody, welcome to Thursdays in the Parables. I hope your Thursday is going well. I, for one, am thankful that the weather is starting to get cooler because that means fall is on its way. And even though we're getting a lot of rain, I do really like the fact that our temperatures are really cool. I don't know how many of you remember, but if you think about this time last year, I believe it was the first week of October, we still had temperatures up into the mid-90s. So this is definitely a relief right now compared to what we were experiencing last year. So this week we are looking at the parable of the Pharisee and the Publican, which is a parable that's probably familiar to most people, one of the more common parables to study. And that is what we are going to look at. Again, we break down our examination of this parable into three sections. We talk about the background, the text, and then the application. So, looking at the background to this parable, again, it's in the same chapter as the parable we talked about last week, the parable of the unjust judge. This may be a separate occasion when Jesus gives this parable, but it is connected in the idea of being focused on prayer. Concerning prayer, and that's again what we're looking at tonight. We see in verse 9 the occasion that brings this about. It says that Jesus spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. So whether or not Jesus is actually hearing people, carry forth this idea about how they're speaking, or maybe it's similar to how Jesus responded to the thoughts of Simon the Pharisee back in Luke chapter 7, Jesus understands that there are people that are listening, whether it's his disciples or just general people that are not part of his disciples that are listening to him speak, understands that some of them thought of themselves as righteous, and because of this, they look down on certain other people. And so really, this parable is going to address the mindset of those that trusted that they themselves were righteous and that they were better than other people. And so, in large part, whereas Jesus has talked about in the prior two parables, and especially the parable of the unjust judge, about why we should pray to God, Jesus is going to emphasize that we have to approach prayer the right way if we want God to hear our prayers. Now, what's going to be described here is an occasion where two men go into the temple to pray. And it's important to keep in mind that there were set aside times when a lot of the Jews would go to the temple to pray. You had every day a morning and an evening or an afternoon sacrifice that was made, and it was common for some Jews to go into the temple to pray at those times. One of which was, I believe it's correct, the third hour. I know for sure the ninth hour, but 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. in the afternoon were two common times when the Jews would go to pray. And maybe this is what's going on here. Generally, you would expect to be a large group of people here. So it's not just two individuals that are by themselves. The indication of what we might picture in our mind is that there are a lot of people gathered here to pray. But two individuals are going to be pointed out in particular. Generally, these prayers are often done aloud. Generally, we think about doing prayers in silent if we're in front of other people who are, not a part of the congregation or are not praying with us. We do it in silent. Generally, they would do their prayers aloud. So more than likely, these are prayers that are not just thought, they are spoken as well. And the two individuals under consideration are people that are emphasized a lot in the New Testament. So the Pharisees, we know that they are a people that are often esteemed, or were often esteemed by the people. Again, these are the religious leaders. They're thought to know the law. If anybody is going to be righteous, you're going to think about the Pharisees as being a people that are holy and clean. Publicans, on the other hand, are the exact opposite. There are some writings of Judaism, and maybe this was true of some of the Jews at that time, that thought about tax collectors being on the same level as a murderer. Generally, tax collectors had to pay to have the right to tax the people, and a lot of times some of these publicans did commit extortion, or they took more money than what they should have, which is what the Pharisee in this parable is going to call out this particular sin that he is not. And so the publicans are looked down upon. The Pharisees are esteemed by the people. You would think that when it came to approaching prayer, that the Pharisee is going to be accepted by God. His prayer is going to be accepted. The publican's prayer is going to be rejected. But Jesus turns that around, as we see now looking at the parable. So verse 10, 2 men go into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector, a publican. Verse 11, we have the prayer of the Pharisee, and it shows two different things. One, it shows that he does not live a sinful lifestyle. Verse 11, the Pharisee stood and prayed thus within himself, with himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. So what's emphasized there in the first verse is that in the mind of the Pharisee, he's not living in a lifestyle of sin. Tax collectors were thought to live in lifestyles of sin because of the nature of their work. But the Pharisee is emphasizing that, at least in one regard, he's not living in a sinful lifestyle. And we don't have any reason to necessarily doubt that by this prayer. So that's something that's going good for him. But you note at the end of verse 11 that he specifically points out this other man that is praying as well, that it is this tax collector. And so the Pharisee is in sort of contrasting that he lives a lifestyle that is pleasing to God, whereas he indicates, sort of as a side remark, that this publican that's praying over here is not living a perfect lifestyle. And that's a red flag though, right? Because, the Pharisee doesn't know this publican, but he's making an assessment about them because of the nature of the publican's work, which, as we're going to see, was a wrong, incorrect assessment. Verse 12, the second thing is revealed is that he essentially does everything that is expected of him. Verse 12, he says, I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. Now, under the law of Moses, it was only required for a Jew to fast only one day of the year. That was on the Day of Atonement. But sometimes whether due to mourning or maybe as an attempt to show a greater sense of religious fervor, we could say, sometimes people fasted more than just that one day a week. And maybe what's being emphasized here by the Pharisee, that he fasts twice a week. There were traditions that emphasized fasting, but he's going to show that, in terms of doing what's expected, when it came to fasting, the Pharisee's doing more than what was expected of him. Not only that, he gives tithes of all that he possesses. He does what is expected of him. So you think that the Pharisee, at least in his mind, thinks that he is a righteous individual because of what he has done, the fact that he doesn't live a sinful lifestyle. But then you have the publican, or the tax collector, verse 13, and the tax collector's prayer is simply about himself, but not in a selfish way. Rather, he has a correct view of his location or of his status when it came to being righteous. Verse 13, the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. So at the end of the day, what Jesus is contrasting here is a Pharisee that essentially says that I am righteous because I don't live a sinful lifestyle and I've done everything that is expected of me. Even when it comes to fasting, I've done more than what's expected of me. That was a Pharisee's idea of righteousness based on how he approached God in prayer. But the publican's prayer, he notes that essentially I cannot be righteous outside of the mercy of God. Right? That's why he says when he in his prayer, the emphasis being, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. He's not going to be like the Pharisee and talk about what he's done and avoiding all the wrongful things to show that he is righteous before God. He essentially in his prayer says that, God, if I don't have your mercy, then I cannot be righteous. So he is not a self-righteous individual, unlike the Pharisee. Which again goes back to verse 9. Jesus is trying to point out the folly of those that think that they are righteous in and of themselves. Verse 14, Jesus commends the publican in the end. I tell you that this man, the publican, went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus commends the publican in the end because he understood where righteousness came from. It did not come in and of himself. he could not have righteousness apart from God. And that's why the publican, even though he was looked down upon by the Pharisee and by many in society, that's why he went to his house justified. And it is interesting noting this parable that a chapter later you read about another publican that Jesus encounters. And his name was Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus was looked down upon. Some questioned Jesus for going to eat in the house of Zacchaeus. But if you look at Luke 19, verse 9, Jesus said after, Zacchaeus talks about the things that he done, he said, "Today salvation has come to this house because he is also a son of Abraham, for the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost." So it's interesting to note this parable comes immediately a chapter before Jesus is actually going to personally commend a publican in the form of Zacchaeus. But again, we're all thinking about here self-righteousness. And so when it comes to the application, there are two things we want to keep in mind for us. We always have to remember that righteousness does not come by our own merit. And sometimes we might lose sight of that. And that's not to suggest that we don't need to work in the church. It doesn't mean that we need to stop doing good things and carrying out the work of the church. But it's sort of a reminder for us to keep in mind that we can do all of those good things, but if we're not, reliant on the mercy of God, and if we have the improper attitude on looking down on others, it doesn't matter what good works we do, we're never going to be pleasing to God if we have that type of mindset. Galatians chapter 3 is sort of close to what we've been talking about in our Romans class on Sunday morning, where we have talked about over and over again the law of Moses and how, righteousness doesn't come by it. But Galatians chapter 3, verse 21, Paul is sort of reiterating this same point to the church there. It says in verse 21, "Truly righteousness would have been by the law, but the Scriptures confined all are under sin, that the promise by faith in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe." And there were some Jews that thought to themselves, that if we carry out all the tasks of the law of Moses, then we are righteous. And what Paul is saying is, there's no one that has ever lived. All are under sin because no one has ever, outside of Christ, no one has ever completely lived up to the law of Moses. There's not been one example in human history, again, apart from Christ, where someone has been able to be righteous solely by their own merit. Paul says that Paul is making that point in Galatians 3:21 and 22. And that's the point for us. We always have to keep in mind that we are dependent on the mercy of God, and that's how righteousness comes. We cannot be self-righteous like this Pharisee. We have to keep that mindset. And in part that goes to thinking about last week's parable. If we have that mindset that the widow had in Luke 18:1 through 8, we are going to avoid being self-righteous individuals and despising others in the process. Because again, the widow was the most vulnerable figure in society. One of the most vulnerable figures in society. She had to rely on someone to help her out. In that case, it was a judge to settle some dispute with her adversary. Likewise for us, we as Christians, because we have all fallen under sin, we have to keep in mind that we are all dependent on God for removing the problem of sin. And if we're all dependent on God in that way, there's no room for us to be self-righteous and to look down on others as lesser human beings than us. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 12, Peter in a way sort of demonstrates that idea where he's quoting from Psalm chapter 34. He says, "For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and His ears are open to their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." You can't have righteousness without God, and those who are self-righteous are essentially those who do evil, because they say you essentially are saying that you don't need God for righteousness. God does not listen to those prayers. You see verse 12 though, 1 Peter 3 verse 12, God's ears are open to the prayers of the righteous. And righteousness comes through our obedience to Jesus. And so that goes to show we cannot be self-righteous individuals and expect God to have respect for our prayers. And those are 2 points of application that we can draw. we're going to go ahead and stop here because we're already at 15 minutes. But thank you for your time and your attention, and I hope to be able to see you all on Sunday.